He stopped her for no reason. He accused her of lying. But when he tried to take control, he learned the hard way that she wasn't the one to mess with. The late afternoon sun hung low over River City, Louisiana, casting long golden shadows over the cracked sidewalks. Lieutenant Ava Brooks moved through the streets with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of discipline, from knowing exactly who she was. Her deep brown eyes scanned the neighborhood, familiar yet distant, like a childhood home left untouched for too long. She hadn't been back in 7 years, not since she enlisted, not since she buried her mother. It was strange how little had changed. The same corner store still advertised 2-for-1 sodas, the same barber shop, its faded sign still clinging to the wall, the same basketball court where kids played like their lives depended on it. The laughter, the voices, the smell of fried fish from old Miss Lorraine's restaurant. All of it wrapped around her, pulling her back into memories she hadn't thought about in years. She adjusted the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Ava wasn't wearing anything that screamed military, just a plain fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, and well-worn sneakers. But even in civilian clothes, she carried herself differently. Shoulders squared, chin level, steps measured. It wasn't something she could turn off. Her father used to call it warrior posture. She smiled faintly at the thought. He would have been proud if he were still here. As she passed a group of teenage boys huddled outside a corner store, one of them, maybe 16, glanced up. He did a quick double take, then nodded respectfully. "Military?" he asked. Ava paused, meeting his gaze. "Something like that," she replied. The boy grinned. "Figured, my cousin's in the army, he walks like you." Before she could respond, one of his friends called him inside, and just like that he was gone. She exhaled slowly. Moments like that reminded her why she fought, why she endured. She had spent years in places most people only saw in war documentaries. Kabul, Fallujah, Mogadishu. She had led teams through the dead of night, through chaos and enemy fire, through sandstorms that swallowed sound and light. And now here she was, back home, walking streets that felt both familiar and foreign. She had spent her 20s in war zones, her 30s trying to process what war had done to her. Now, at 40, she wasn't sure what home even meant anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted when a patrol car crept up beside her, its slow crawl out of place in a neighborhood where cops usually sped through without a second glance. She kept walking, pretending not to notice. But she knew the drill. The window rolled down. A gravelly voice called out, "Excuse me, miss." She stopped, turned slightly and saw him. Officer Jake Caldwell, mid-40s, crew cut, thick arms, and the kind of smirk that said he enjoyed this a little too much. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but she could feel them scanning her like she was out of place. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" he asked. Ava stared at him for a beat, her expression unreadable. She had encountered men like him before, men who saw a confident woman and mistook it for a challenge. She shifted the strap of her duffel bag. "Just walking," she replied, her tone steady. "Where to?" he pressed, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. Ava arched a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street." Caldwell didn't like that. His smirk faded just a little. "We've had some break-ins around here," he said. "Gotta make sure everything's in order." Ave held his gaze, unfazed. "You see me breaking into something?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned against the open window, exhaling sharply. "Just doing my job." Ava exhaled through her nose, fighting the urge to shake her head. "Well, I'm just walking." She could feel the weight of the moment shifting. Caldwell wasn't looking for a conversation, he was looking for control. And something about her, whether it was her presence or the way she refused to shrink, wasn't sitting right with him. She had two choices, keep engaging or walk away. But before she could decide, Caldwell put the car in park. "Hold on a second," he said. "Let's see some ID." Ava didn't move. She'd been trained to assess threats, surroundings, exits. And right now she wasn't just assessing a man in uniform, she was assessing a man who was getting too comfortable pushing his authority. But she already knew one thing. This wasn't over. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chatter from a nearby store. But in this moment, none of that mattered. The tension between Ava Brooks and Officer Jake Caldwell was thick, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. "Let me see some ID," Caldwell repeated, this time with less patience. Ava glanced at his hands. His right thumb casually rested near the latch of his holster, a silent warning, intentional or not. She could feel the heat of eyes on her. A few people had noticed the stopsams slowed their steps, watching, waiting. She reached into her pocket slowly, keeping her movements measured. She pulled out her military ID and held it up, but didn't hand it over. Caldwell squinted at it, then back at her. "Military, huh?" His tone was unreadable, but Ava had encountered men like him before, the kind who saw a woman like her and decided that the uniform wasn't enough, the rank wasn't enough. "Where exactly do you serve?" he asked. "I don't answer unnecessary questions," she said calmly. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, lips pressing together. "That's so?" He snatched the ID from her hand before she could react, turning it over between his fingers. A smug smirk crept onto his face. "Navy SEALs," he read aloud, dragging out the words like they were some kind of joke. "That's cute." A flicker of heat passed through Ava's chest, not anger but annoyance. The same kind she'd felt 100 times before in rooms filled with men who assumed she didn't belong. "Return it." Her voice was firm, controlled. Caldwell studied her, head tilting slightly like he was trying to decide whether she was worth the trouble. "You know," he began, "I've been on the force for 20 years, seen all kinds of people come through this neighborhood." He paused, eyeing her. "Never met a woman Navy SEAL before. You sure this isn't The insult was so blatant, so ridiculous, that Ava almost laughed. "You can run it through your system," she said flatly. "You'll find out soon enough." But that wasn't what Caldwell wanted. He wanted a reaction. He turned the card over again, lips curling as if he had already decided she was lying. "You expect me to believe you've been out there fighting for this country? Please." A shift, a small one, but Ava caught it. The people watching. Their curiosity was changing. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was something else now. A young woman stood on the sidewalk, phone in her hand, recording. She wasn't hiding it. She wanted Caldwell to see. That was the thing about power. It changed depending on who was watching. Caldwell noticed, his shoulders squared slightly, his stance shifting. "You got a problem?" he asked the woman. She didn't answer, just kept recording. Ava, still standing perfectly still, smirked just a little. Now Caldwell was the one under a microscope. He flicked his gaze back to her, jaw clenching. "I don't appreciate people trying to make a show out of me doing my job." "Then stop putting on a show," Ava said. A flash of something dark passed through his expression. He stepped closer, just an inch, but it was enough. A deliberate move, a challenge. Ava didn't budge. "I don't know who you think you are," Caldwell said, voice low. "But out here, I make the call." Her smile was subtle, just enough to let him know he was making a mistake. "You sure about that?" Caldwell's grip tightened on her ID, and then he did exactly what she expected. He reached for her wrist. Bad idea. The moment Caldwell's fingers brushed Ava's wrist, she moved fast, precise, calculated. Her arm shifted just enough to break his grip before it even fully formed. Not aggressively, not in a way that could be mistaken for an attack, just enough to show control. Caldwell's eyes flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected that. The crowd watching grew larger. The woman with the phone recording took a step forward. A man across the street folded his arms, shaking his head. A couple by a food truck had stopped eating entirely. All eyes were on them. Ava let a breath slip through her nose, steadying herself. Her training had drilled restraint into her bones. Discipline first, always. "That's assault, Harper." Caldwell's voice carried too much confidence, like he thought those words alone gave him power. Ava barely blinked. "No, it's called avoiding unnecessary contact." His expression darkened. "You think this is a joke?" She tilted her head slightly. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" A flicker of frustration passed over his face. Caldwell had expected submission, cooperation at the very least. Instead, he was getting resistance wrapped in calm, unshakable composure. He didn't like it. His hand moved toward his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup." "Backup for what?" Ava cut in smoothly. Caldwell's mouth pressed into a thin line. "For an uncooperative suspect." A scoff from the crowd. Someone muttered, "This is some bull," before catching themselves. The woman with the phone spoke up. "Uncooperative. You're the only one getting loud." Caldwell's ears burned red, but he didn't turn toward her. He was too locked in now, too deep in his own pride. Ava could see it. She'd been in enough tense situations to recognize a man at a breaking point. Caldwell wasn't going to back down, not now, not with so many eyes on him. She had to choose her next words carefully. "Officer Caldwell," she said, her tone measured, "you're making a mistake." His nostrils flared. "No!" "You made the mistake when you decided you could walk away from me." He took a step closer, one step too many. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Ava inhaled slowly. She could feel the shift in energy. The moment was spiraling. She knew where this was headed. Caldwell wanted to make an example out of her. He wanted her in cuffs, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she hadn't obeyed him the way he expected, and that she could not allow. The crowd sensed it too. A murmur rolled through them. People were moving their phones up higher. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Ava could feel her pulse steadying, her instincts sharpening. She had three choices: let him cuff her, give in, allow herself to be treated like a criminal in front of the entire neighborhood, not an option; run, force a chase, even worse. Stop this before it escalates into something neither of them could come back from. She chose the third. "Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but firm, "if you put those cuffs on me, you're going to regret it." His smirk returned, but this time it was forced. "That a threat?" he asked, his voice tinged with mockery. Ava's eyes never wavered. "No, it's a fact." But Caldwell had already made up his mind. His hand dropped to his belt, and that was the last mistake he made that day. The moment Caldwell reached for his cuffs, Ava moved fast, smooth, intentional. Before his fingers could even brush the metal, she pivoted. A simple shift of her stance, a calculated redirection. One step forward, one step to the side, nothing more. But it was enough. Caldwell's balance wavered, his eyes widened for just a fraction of a second as he realized he wasn't in control anymore. Ava didn't attack. She didn't need to. All she did was remove herself from his grasp in a way that was so seamless, so precise, that Caldwell looked ridiculous to the crowd. It must have seemed like he was fumbling, stumbling over his own feet. And that was worse than any punch. The gasps from the bystanders confirmed it. "Damn, she slipped right out of that," someone muttered. The young woman with the phone zoomed in, her expression unreadable. Caldwell's face flushed crimson. His breath came quicker now, his chest rising and falling like he had just been insulted in the worst way imaginable. Ava stood completely still, her hands relaxed at her sides. "Officer Caldwell," she said slowly, carefully, "you're losing control of the situation." His jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. She had humiliated him without even touching him. He couldn't let that stand. "Turn around, hands behind your back." His voice was sharp now, clipped with pure frustration. Ava exhaled through her nose. For what? Resisting arrest? A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. Arrest for what? A man near the corner store called out. We all saw that. She didn't touch you, man. Caldwell ignored them, his fingers flexed, itching for something to grab onto. Ava had seen this before. A man backed into a corner, desperate to regain his power. She gave him one last chance. You don't want to do this, she said evenly. Think carefully. Caldwell's breathing grew heavier. His pride was screaming at him, demanding he take control, prove his authority, put her in her place. So he made his choice. He lunged. Bad move. Ava's body reacted before her mind had to. Her foot shifted, her hands moved. She caught his wrist mid-air, twisted it with just enough force to redirect his momentum. Suddenly Caldwell was the one off balance. In less than a second she had him turned, his own arm bent in a way that made movement impossible. She hadn't hurt him, hadn't even applied full force, but to the onlookers, the recording cameras, and most importantly to Caldwell himself, he had just been flipped like a rookie. And that was worse than anything else. A man in uniform, outmatched in broad daylight, in front of an entire crowd, by a woman. He thought he could intimidate her. Caldwell's breath came hard and uneven, his body stiffened in shock. Ava held him there for just a second longer, long enough for him to understand. Then she let go. Caldwell stumbled forward, catching himself, his arms flailing for just a moment, just long enough for every phone camera to capture it. The crowd erupted. Oh, no way, she just flipped his ass. The woman recording shook her head, grinning now. I got every second of that. Caldwell's hands curled into fists. His entire body radiated pure humiliation. Ava stayed completely calm. Are we done? She asked, her voice steady. Caldwell didn't answer. He couldn't. Then a new voice cut through the air. What the hell is going on here? A second patrol car had just pulled up. Sergeant William Burke, older, more experienced, and from the way his eyes flickered between them, he already knew something had gone very wrong. Sergeant Burke stepped out of his patrol car with calculated authority, his sharp blue eyes flicked between Caldwell, face red, hands clenched, breathing heavy, and Ava, standing calm and unshaken in the middle of the street. But it wasn't just them anymore. The entire block was watching. Phones were up. Conversations had stopped. People weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Burke exhaled sharply. He already knew what happened, but still, he turned to Caldwell. First Officer Caldwell, explain. Caldwell's jaw worked, but no words came out immediately. He was too deep in his own humiliation, too rattled by the fact that he had just been flipped in broad daylight. Ava could see the battle happening inside his head. He wanted to lie, to twist the story in his favor, to make himself the victim. But then Burke's gaze swept over the camera's recording, the murmurs of the crowd, the unmistakable stain of public embarrassment already spreading, and Caldwell knew there was no way out of this. She resisted, he said finally, his voice low, strained, wouldn't comply, got aggressive. A scoff came from the young woman still filming. That's a lie, and we all saw it. Burke didn't acknowledge her, but Ava caught the tightness in his expression. He wasn't buying it either. He turned to Ava. Is that what happened? She didn't rush her answer. Didn't need to. He stopped me for no reason, asked for my ID, I gave it to him. Then he accused me of lying about who I am. She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. When I refused to let him put cuffs on me for nothing, he reached for me. I stopped him. Burke exhaled slowly. He was assessing, calculating. He knew the optics of this, a white cop, a black woman, a crowd watching with phones up, a power struggle that had gone way too far. Then his eyes landed on the ID still clutched in Caldwell's hand. His expression shifted. Recognition? Then realization. then regret. "Lieutenant Harper," Burke's voice softened, but it was sharp now, like the edge of a blade. Caldwell's entire body went still the moment her rank left Burke's mouth. It was over. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Caldwell's face paled, his posture stiffening. Ava didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just waited. Burke's voice was quieter now, but sharper. "You're a Navy SEAL." "Yes, sir." Silence. Burke's gaze flicked back to Caldwell. "You knew that?" Caldwell's fingers twitched around the ID. Burke didn't wait for an excuse. He turned to the crowd. "Anyone have footage of this interaction?" At least 10 hands shot up. The young woman with the phone smirked. "I got everything." Caldwell's breath hitched. He knew what was coming. Burke's voice was low, even. "Officer Caldwell, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps, whispers, a low ripple of disbelief. Caldwell's face contorted. His hands balled into fists. "You can't be serious." "I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse." Burke's tone had finality to it, a warning. Caldwell's nostrils flared. His entire body trembled with rage, but he had nothing left. Ava held his gaze one last time. No words, just understanding. She had won, and he knew it. Burke turned to Ava, his posture shifting slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, but respectful. "Lieutenant Harper, do you wish to press charges?" The air stilled. Caldwell froze, his breath shallow. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Ava let the question settle, let the weight of it hang over Caldwell like a final judgment. And then she exhaled. No. A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Caldwell stared at her, stunned. Burke studied her for a long moment. "You sure?" Ava nodded. "I didn't come home looking for a fight. I just wanted to walk in my own neighborhood." The words hit hard. Burke sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Understood." "What happens to him now?" she asked. Burke didn't sugarcoat it. "Internal review, likely suspension, maybe worse." Caldwell looked sick. Ava didn't react. It wasn't her concern anymore. She turned to leave, but then Caldwell did something no one expected. He spoke. "Well." His voice was quiet, stiff. Ava stopped and turned back, just enough to meet his eyes. Her answer was simple. "Because I already taught you the lesson you needed to learn." And with that she walked away. Ava walked down the sidewalk, shoulders squared, steps steady. She didn't need to turn around to know that every eye in the crowd followed her departure. Somewhere behind her, Caldwell still stood, his entire career crumbling around him. A voice from the crowd cut through the silence. "That's what happens when you mess with the wrong one." A few quiet chuckles, some murmurs. The tension was lifting, shifting into something else, a moment people wouldn't forget. Burke didn't move for a few seconds, his eyes locked on Caldwell. "Go home, Officer Caldwell." Caldwell didn't argue. He just turned stiffly, making his way back to his squad car, his hands tight by his sides. The cameras followed him. His humiliation was now public record. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Burke exhaled and turned to the crowd. "The show's over, folks." Some people left, but others lingered, still murmuring. The young woman with the phone gave Burke a hard stare before lowering her camera. "He'll be back on duty in a few weeks, won't he?" she asked, unimpressed. Burke didn't answer. He knew better than to make promises. "Just send the footage in," he said, before heading back to his car. Ava kept walking, but she wasn't aimless. She wasn't the type to get rattled, not anymore. Years of training, deployments, and high-pressure missions had built something inside her that couldn't be easily shaken. But that didn't mean she was numb. As she passed the storefront, she caught her reflection in the glass. Same stance, same confidence, but something deep in her chest still burned. It wasn't anger, it was frustration. Not just at Caldwell, not just at this one encounter, but at the fact that it never really ended. She had faced worse than him overseas, but there was something about having to fight the same battles at home that left a weight in her stomach. Her father's voice rang in her ears. Pick your fights, win the ones that matter. She had won this one. But how many more would there be? She kept walking, pushing the thought aside. Inside the police station, the fallout had already begun. Burke sat at his desk, the weight of the situation sinking in. The footage had already been submitted. The precinct would have no choice but to review it. And Caldwell? He was done. Maybe not officially, maybe not immediately, but his reputation wouldn't recover. His authority had been publicly shattered, and that was something no badge could fix. Burke sighed, rubbing his temples. He had known Caldwell had a problem, had ignored the signs. But now? Now it was on record, and the city was watching. Ava sat on the back steps of her father's old house. The worn wooden planks creaked slightly beneath her. The air was warm, thick with the scent of cut grass and the distant sizzle of something frying in a neighbor's kitchen. She let her shoulders relax for the first time all day. She was home, but what did that even mean anymore? Her hands rested on her knees, fingers absently tracing the seams of her cargo pants. She'd spent years fighting battles overseas, defending a country that still couldn't always see her for what she was, and today had been a reminder of that. The screen door behind her creaked open. You always sit like that when you're thinking. She didn't have to turn to know the voice. Uncle Ray. He stepped onto the porch, lowering himself onto the steps beside her. Broad shoulders, gray at his temples, a man who had seen his own share of fights, just not the kind with bullets. He set a bottle of iced tea beside her, then popped his open with a quiet hiss. For a moment, they just sat there. Then Ray exhaled through his nose. So you made the news? Ava huffed a small dry chuckle. Wasn't planning on it. Ray shook his head. Never are. But trouble finds us anyway. She picked up the bottle, rolling the condensation between her fingers. Wasn't trouble, she muttered. Ray's side made her. Wasn't peace either. She didn't answer right away because he wasn't wrong. Ava had been trained to engage enemies, to neutralize threats, to walk into danger and come out the other side. But what about battles like today? The ones that weren't fought with fists or weapons, but with perception, power, and prejudice. She tilted the bottle back, letting the cold tea wash away the dryness in her throat. Ray watched her for a beat, then leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. You handled yourself well, girl. She nodded slowly. Did what I had to. Ray gave a small chuckle. Just like your father. That made her smile. Her father had always taught her that strength wasn't just about fighting, it was about knowing when not to. Simmons will feel this for a long time. Ray's tone was thoughtful, but more than that. A lot of people saw what happened today, and they'll remember it. Ava turned the bottle in her hands. Does it ever change anything? She asked. Or do we just keep fighting the same fight over and over? Ray sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. You're asking the wrong question. She glanced at him. He tapped his bottle against his knee. The question isn't whether it changes everything. It's whether it changes something. Ava let that sink in. He was right. She hadn't walked away from today changing the world, but maybe she'd changed something. Maybe some kid in that crowd saw what happened and realized he didn't have to shrink when authority got in his face. Maybe some other officer saw it and thought twice about pulling the same stunt. Maybe even Caldwell, though she doubted it, would take a long, hard look at himself. And that was enough for now. Ray nudged her with his elbow. So what now? She exhaled, setting her bottle down. I keep walking. His grin was small but full of pride. That's my girl. Sometimes the real fight isn't about winning or losing, he said, his voice low but strong. It's about standing your ground, even when the world tells you to step aside. It's about showing up, speaking up, and refusing to shrink, because even if you don't change everything, you might change something, and sometimes that's enough to start the shift. Like, share, subscribe, keep the conversation going, because these stories matter.